All right. I'm Humaira Mariam, a final year master's student of English and Cultural Studies, Christ University, Bangalore. I extend a very warm welcome to all our participants. And before I introduce our speaker for today, I would like to share a few words about Mezzatera Talk series organized on an ongoing basis by the Department of English and Cultural Studies. We have borrowed the term Mezzatera from the Egyptian writer and activist Adaf Swift from her book Mezzatera Fragments from the Common Ground, in which she envisages the space as a common ground, a meeting point, and an area of overlap. Adhering to Swift's term in letter and spirit, our webinar series aims to be a common meeting ground, not just for people, but for ideas and creative flux to be reimagined, reshaped, and redeployed in the face of changing realities that are emerging and will continue to emerge as we find ourselves in an unprecedented moment and unfamiliar landscapes. So among the major shifts we have witnessed in the 21st century is definitely the growing influence of digital technology on our everyday lives. This has also impacted the way education, activism, and artistic practice are imagined and practiced. So through digital platforms, educationists, practitioners, artists, writers, and others have forged new modes of creating work and engaging with society. While no area of life has remained unaffected, it may be reasonable to say that the impact of digital technology on forms like theater pose a very distinct set of challenges and possibilities, urging us to reconsider fundamental understandings of theater as deeply rooted within liveness. So to share his perspective on the ontological shifts, we have with us today Amitesh Grover, an award-winning interdisciplinary artist who studied at the University of London and is presently assistant professor at the National School of Drama, New Delhi. In his work, Amitesh Grover moves beyond theater into visual art, film, installation, and digital art. His practice shifts away from the artwork or medium to produce open-ended actions, series, processes, and projects. His work is anchored in social practice and revolves around themes like absence or presence, staging abandonment, the necessity of remembering, the performance of resistance to keep on living, and how to embody unsayable knowledge. His projects are shown internationally in theaters, galleries, public spaces, and on the internet. He also teaches, writes, and curates for performance. This particular Mezzatera talk is a public outreach event of the Technocultures Project, led by Dr. Rashmi Soni in collaboration with students of the MA in English and Cultural Studies program. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming Amitesh Grover, who will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, followed by an interaction with the audience. So please type your questions into the chat box and we will take them at the end of the talk. Over to you, Mr. Grover.
Thank you, Humaira. Thank you, Rashmi. Rashmi is a dear friend from Delhi. Although we didn't meet much when she was here, I was closely following her teaching in Delhi and also was in touch with her students here. I'm very happy to know that this tradition continues, and Humaira, through you and through your research project, I am back in contact with Rashmi and also with your colleagues and friends in your MA course. So thank you so much for inviting me and for introducing me. I quite like the idea of Mezzatera, which is to look for a common ground from where we shall speak, which we shall cohabit. Um, it's an interesting idea, especially for the time that we are not able to depend on our most reliable ally, which is public assembly. We were so used to, especially in the theater and in the art field, we are so used to the idea of public assembly and to access it whenever we like, however we like, and we also defend the freedom and sovereignty of the public space. That we take it for granted. And for the last 1 year, I was sharing it with a friend yesterday that I cannot believe that it has been more than a year and I haven't been part of public assembly in any shape or form. So these are extremely tough times. Before I start my talk today, I also want to express my solidarity um, and the fact that I share everybody who's grieving and who has lost or um, is anxious about their loved ones in this tough time that we're going through. Delhi has gone through a massive crisis, and I hear that Bangalore has now entered this crisis as well. And I really hope that we come out of this crisis as soon as we can. Now, the work that I will talk about today is a kind of work that sits uneasily. You cannot classify it as one coming from one discipline. My background is from theatre. I'm trained in theatre, and then I went on to do an MFA. Sort of I segued into visual arts, film and installation, and since I have been trying to sort of build an interdisciplinary practice because I believe that the ideas that I want to work with and the sort of the modes in which I want to make work uh, can't belong to one discipline. So that I find myself often working in interdisciplinary ways, crossing, transcending borders, learning from different disciplines, learning from my friends and colleagues, and trying to put into practice a sort of a body of work that uh, has an utter disregard for borders. And all of this happens intuitively. I don't think I kind of set out to develop interdisciplinary practice. It just so happened that uh, my artistic responses at different times have had to rely on different modalities and different disciplines, and I did not want to get limited by my training in one discipline or another. So a lot of what I make is something that I learn on the job, as it were, or in the studio. Um, I I am more a student than a teacher. I'm still learning a lot with every project, and I think for me, projects are of most value when they generate knowledge and ask questions. And so every project that I do, fortunately for me, goes on to be generative in more ways than one. And then I'm quite happy to share the questions and my learnings with anybody I can. And so today is that opportunity. So to talk to you about work that I recently made, the questions that I was facing, what and how we were able to make it, and then, of course, um, the lingering thoughts and questions post work. So I'm going to share my screen. Hope everyone can see this.
Yeah, we
Just
can.
give me right. Okay, great. So right. So roughly, sort of the this talk is going to revolve around um, theater in the age of cyberculture. Now, I know that technocultures is the broad theme under which these series of talks is happening, and it'll be nice to talk about uh, what does technocultures mean in from a South Asian perspective, and what does it mean for artists who are producing this kind of work. For me, I start with these two uh, sort of two pronged kind of way of thinking about it. One is performing with our bodies, and the other is performing with code. And I find uh, that both bodies and code today are engaged in a kind of a very peculiar and very particular um, dialogue, a very particular interaction. And I'll sort of open up this what this dialogue could be, and what this interaction could be as I talk about the work. But in my recent experience, I have discovered that bodies and code are their fates and the way they work are somehow entwined in our reality today. So that on one hand, there are bodies that are performing the labor to develop code and to test code and then to release code uh, in on the internet and through apps, etc. Um, the the way the code works also affects the way uh, bodies understand themselves and their surroundings in returns. And so whether we talk about social media, or whether we talk about how different communication apps work, or we talk about how the relationship between say science or different kinds of organizing principles in our society today, of course, a part of which is surveillance, um, and a part of which is uh, uh, intimate data collection and some kind of a sort of a biological control. That code and the body, and body and the code are uh, entwined now, and to understand this sort of entanglement, it's very important for us to look at it politically, aesthetically, and also from my perspective as an artist, to um, think about interventions and interruptions, and how am I able to sort of intervene in this relationship. Uh, so so I think as an artist, I think a lot about this in many of my works that are very directly technological, are born out of these intentions and concerns. This particular work that I'm going to talk about today is called The Last Poet, and I started making this roughly a year ago, in the month of May, June 2020. And so this was about a couple of months after the lockdown, 3 months actually after the lockdown had been announced. And I had already sort of amongst everyone else, I was finding myself in a very peculiar uh, condition. And this condition was not just about the biological virus. Of course, it took us about a few months to understand um, the the threat that we were facing with uh, against this virus, but also there were other kinds of um, threats that had sort of, you know, dovetailed this biological threat, um, and and one of the threats that came soon after the virus landed in India was the threat of increased authoritarianism, and the fact that uh, artists, activists, poets, writers, young students um, who had participated in protests and in dissents across the country were being picked up and questioned, and were also being incarcerated very unjustly. So I started to think about the threat of the written word along with the threat of the virus. Uh, and began to imagine um, if I were to make a project sitting under lockdown, not being able to move at all, and not having the resources that theatre walas are so used to, which is studio space, a theatre, and getting together and rehearsing. Um, what will this project look like? So I started with research. This is kind of a method that I follow. I do sort of extensive research, and in which I would read, I would conduct interviews, I would meet people, and lay some kind of a foundation for the project that I want to do. So, and this is how I started. I started to collect testimonies and interviews, um, and call people and meet them online, um, especially people and families who had their friends or their family member being picked up and incarcerated. I started to collect poetry that was written in dissent. I started to also read up on um, the unfortunate subcontinental history we have with poets being sent to jail. And I discovered that it is a very notorious but also simultaneously a glorious history of about 200 years um, of uh, poets, people's poets, poets who have uh, very, very boldly and clearly and extremely movingly written about the oppressor and written about uh, the, the, the modes in which oppression is carried out, and their poetry has given strength to the people, um, ending up in jail, sometimes for years and years, and also of the kind of support that they got from the people, and their writings that they authored while being in jail. And so slowly, I think for me, this project was taking shape, which was about a poet. Uh, so this project became about um, a poet who's gone missing, um, and about a people who are searching for their missing poet. So this is what this project tried to do. The last poet sort of attempted to capture a political moment. A poet disappears, a virus spreads within and amongst us, and our world becomes haunted. The audience is invited to immerse themselves in the constancy of this virtual event, a whirling city searching for its missing poet, listless yet hungry, moving yet remaining still. In this world, there are multi-lobes, and there are multiple possibilities in how you can experience it. And so what I did was that I started to think of a project that was multi-layered, in the sense I would invite uh, theater, film, sound art, creative coding, digital scenography, and live performance, um, and that it would anchor itself in feelings of anonymity and estrangement in a city that had turned extreme. Serendipity Arts Foundation was the one that funded it, and it also premiered at the Serendipity Arts Festival that was held entirely virtually in December 2020. So it was took us about 7 to 8 months to create, test, and then premiere this work. But I mean, one of the first things that I started to think about was the fact that this project had to be entirely online, and um, I don't know if some of you had the fortune to watch online theater last year, and you must have noticed that many um, theater artists, not just in India but abroad as well, were trying to adapt the softwares that were already in the public domain, softwares like Zoom and Google Meet and other kinds of available software, and adapting their theaters and their performances to this software. Now, that was something that I was quite clear about that I didn't want to do. I wanted to think afresh from scratch, and I wanted to not just create a work for online circulation and consumption, but also I wanted to think about the architecture, the venue within which it would be experienced. And I was reading Trickster City around that time, and one of the sort of paragraphs that uh, became quite relevant at that time, and this was something that was also shared by my digital scenographers, was that there's this interesting paragraph that talks about the difference between space and place. A place in Nishastga is a place where the gaze has not been fixed and time has not yet been disciplined, where nobody has yet been described as a vagabond. When a space loses its Nishastga, it condenses into Jaga, which stands for place. By then, it has moved through its processes of working out what it wants to remember and what it wants to forget, who it wants to keep in and who to keep out, which ways of being it finds acceptable and which are the ways it shuns or tries to stay away from. So this sort of transportation from space to place is a journey simultaneously of remembering something and of forgetting something, of excluding and including, and it's as it takes shape, it also loses something. And this, for me, is an interesting metaphor to think about ideas of presence and absence on the internet, and also about what is the place of the internet. Um, we all know that the internet is an an amorphous place where, of course, some spaces and some corners are becoming increasingly private and corporatized, and there are others that are public, and yet there are others that are sort of the dark internet, which are not accessible commonly. Um, I also know that I belong to the generation that experienced Web 1.0 and then transitioned to Web 2.0. And one of the big differences between 1.0 and 2.0 was the promise that the internet carried in its original avatar of a place that was committed and dedicated to democracy um, in a very transparent and open way, and also carried with it the promise of a utopic existence to Web 2.0, which is increasingly sort of controlled and occupied by private capital, and also with a very sort of new sort of ideas of labor and value. Uh, so so I think this paragraph kind of helped me think about how does one begin to think about a performative space, a space, a public space into which people will be invited for performance, and in which there will be uh, sort of these relationships, temporary relationships that will be formed as part of the show. So I invited a very interesting group of programmers and coders, and we started to experiment with code and to generate um, these performative spaces as experiments. We call this process poetic instancing and generative collaborations. Um, and one of the starting points for me was what I see out of my balcony. I was in lockdown, and so the window and the door and the balcony actually became for me my eyes to the world, And on the left, this is what I see from one of my windows. And so these sort of, it's an interesting architectural building, these boxes that are jutting out, um, hanging in mid-air, suspended. Um, this architecture sort of became the starting point for me to begin to imagine what this performing space would look like. Uh, and I'm simultaneously, eternally also inspired by Italo Calvino's um, sort of notion of these imagined cities that he talks about, these 55 very interesting cities that he talks about, in which relationships that people have with each other get visualized architecturally and spatially. Um, and so we started to experiment. This is the code that we uh, were building this generated model on. This code is quite commonly used, I believe, in several art and media institutes across the world. It's called P5, and it is a generative code in the sense that as you uh, fill in these equations and numbers and parts of code, it generates a spatial world, a 3D world. And this is how it did, it generated this. So we were also playing with a lot of Indo-Islamic um, uh, inspiration in terms of architecture. So there are these domes and arches, which were being rendered live by a code that was being written. And depending on how complex and how layered this code is, the 3D world that it generates can become quite rich and quite vivid and quite interesting. And so we worked on this code for about 3 to 4 months, and this led to this 3D world. Uh, the sort of the color, the dominant shade of this 3D world actually comes from a photograph that I had taken of Delhi in October um, 2019, when Delhi had reached the most polluted that it had ever been. And so there was this sort of an orange amber, dirty orange haze throughout Delhi. And so all of us were immersed in it. And I wanted that haze to be um, the dominant sort of shade of this world, where the clarity of vision is not there. So that there are these sort of rooms and buildings and houses that are receding into this haze and disappearing, and then suddenly something comes out of this haze, which is surprising. And we were working with a lot of urban elements like street lamps and benches and cycles, etc., wires, electricity poles, and this entire 3D world was whirling, so that when the audience entered, um, they were in the middle of a slow-moving storm, and the entire city was whirling around them, almost as if the city does not have any gravity, and that uh, there is no up or down, so that the coordinates of north, south, east, west are missing, uh, and it's impossible to tell what is front, what is back. Um, and so you're in the middle of this whirling city that's going around you, and all these sort of boxes and rooms and houses and apartments, and everything is sort of going around you. Um, and all of this is interactable. So you sort of hover your mouse on a on an apartment or a house, and it's clickable, and you click on it. And as you click on it, you're taken inside. Now, inside, as you take an inside, sometimes you meet a performer, um, a live performer, and what you watch on your screen is, in the middle is a performer. he's playing a character, and there are these sort of icons. The show title is on the left, and then there are these about the show and the volume and the full screen and everything. And there's a chat icon, which I'll come back to a little bit later, on right bottom, and the leave button. And as you went inside these rooms, you met these performers who were playing characters. Now, these characters were based on the research that I had done, and subsequently I was joined by a dramaturg, and she started writing, converting all the research that we were doing into fiction, and and so these characters were born out of that fiction. And so, as you met them, these characters were related to the missing poet in one way or another. Sometimes you met this missing poet's family, sometimes you met his neighbors, sometimes you met his friends and colleagues, and at other times you met people who were talking about the missing poet in one way or another. And so you went from room to room, meeting these people who would often share extremely personal, um, sort of personal thoughts and confessions about who the missing poet was and why had he gone missing. And nobody actually knows in this city why this poet has gone missing and what has happened to him. But everybody's conjecturing, everybody's speculating. Um, and so sometimes you meet people who you think are telling you the truth, and then sometimes you meet people who are rumor mongering, and they're spreading rumors, and as you get through the show, it becomes more and more difficult to tell uh, which character is reliable and which character is unreliable. Um, the one way in which you can move out of these rooms is if you pressed the leave button, which appears left bottom. Now, this leave button appears every few minutes. It's not there all the time, and you've got to look out for it as you are experiencing these performances. Um, the leave button might appear, and it stayed often only for a minute or something. And if you wanted to leave the room, you could click on it, and if you wanted to stay on for longer in that room, you could choose to stay on, and the leave button would disappear. Now, all these actors were, of course, also under lockdown, so I had conducted rehearsals entirely online, and every actor had transformed a part of their house in theatrically, for different scenes that they were playing. In this particular instance, this space is a very, very sort of a claustrophobic and a very, very small space that is under the kitchen shelf, just where the trash can is in the kitchen. Um, this space is that. So this actor had actually transformed that little space under the kitchen shelf, right below the sink, um, and attached a bulb there, and was playing this entire scene from there. And when you press the leave button, you would come out in the city and then sort of navigate through the haze, go past a few rooms, and um, choose another room, hover your mouse on another room, and click on it, and then go in. Now, sometimes you may not meet a live performer. Sometimes you actually, as an audience member, uh, watched a short film inside a room. So a film was playing, or sometimes even a sound installation was playing inside. This particular film is based on Bashir Badr's very famous poem, um, and there's a voiceover of the poem that's reciting the poem, and what you see in front is uh, sort of this kind of a very commonly and very publicly available footage of the kind of violence, the kind of society that we've been a part of that has led us to be in the kind of crisis we are in today. A lot of this footage is politically contested today, and sometimes it resurfaces and it's taken down very quickly. And I thought that this project is an interesting project to house this video archive, um, so that it stays in one kind of a house in a room, not easily accessible in the show. You kind of chance upon it if you click on it, watch it, and before you comprehend what this is, the film's over and you're thrown out of the room, and you then have to click another room and go inside and meet another character. There were 5 performers who were playing about 30 different characters. And every time they would finish a scene and a character, a poll would appear on the screen. And this was a 60-second poll, and the audience was asked what they would like to hear about next. And the entire audience voted. And the option that got the most votes, more often than not, was then chosen by the performer to be played subsequently. So the audience was interacting with the show in 2 ways. One was that they could leave the room, abandon the room, or they could continue to watch what was happening in the room. And the other way was that they could um, collectively decide to vote a on a scene title or on a character that they wanted to hear about going forward in the show. And so this poll was conducted multiple times in the show. And so you have to imagine that um, audiences entered the show in different from multiple entry points. Uh, Not everybody entered the same room. All these rooms, all these houses were live, and people were performing inside. And so sometimes you would enter a room in the middle of a performance, and then you chose to stay. And sometimes you would exit a room while the performance was still going on, and sort of meander through the city, drift and land up in another room in another performance. Um, so how you move through the city, where you stayed and for how long as an audience member was entirely up to you. Um, and the interesting part of this poll was that if no audience member voted, the poll would repeat itself. So the performer would sit silent till there were enough votes um, in a poll to decide which scene would get played next. And so this is a collage of different sort of all the different characters that these actors played, and the show was 90 minutes long. So at the end of 90 minutes, the entire audience was automatically thrown out of whichever room they were in, and they were taken to the starting point of this virtual reality, this sort of the far away point from where the city is extremely foggy and unclear, and um, so they returned to that point. And this is just to give you an idea of how we were running the show. For those of you who've done theater and have seen what backstage looks like, in theater you have the green room and the wings and the control rooms from where the sound and the light, and also the costume rooms where characters change, actors change their costumes. But this was a new project, and it required a very different kind of a sort of a digital control platform or a control room. So I had to think about what is it that, how would it look like, and what was the requirement for this kind of a project. So we started to create what we call the stage manager dashboard. On the left, you see the upload button. Um, all audience members that bought tickets for the show, uh, we had about 200, and in some shows that we're going to have next month, we will have up to 300 or 400 people watching simultaneously per show. So everybody registers with their email IDs and their names, and that list gets uploaded on the left side, where you see uh, update users, the title update users, and that list gets updated there so that only those who have registered and bought the tickets can actually enter this show at the time when it begins. Right below update users is the stage control button called Start Show, and this changes into End Show as well. So this is from where the show begins and the show ends. In the middle, the column that says Room Status um, shows me uh, the actors that are live. So actors were also streaming live, because I mean, we had a very complicated setup of how actors would stream into this virtual reality sort of space that we had, um, and how the connection will get patched into the code. So I needed to keep a very close watch on whether these actors were actually live and active. And in each of the rows where you see the actors' names, you also see something called users, where how many audience members are actually inside those rooms watching the actors. So I could also sort of see how audiences, not just how many people were inside a room, but also how people were moving across the city, how many people had left a room and gone to another room. And so I could see different rooms swelling up with numbers, and the whole the traffic that was going um, across the show. And on the right, of course, the biggest square that you see is the chat thread. So um, every audience member had a chat icon that they could click on, and they could send us a technical query if they were fixing troubles, or if they had a question to ask. And in return, we could send a broadcast message. Sometimes this message was purely functional, about waiting a couple of minutes before the show started at the beginning, or um, sometimes it was also poetic. I sent them couplets or excerpts of different poems that we had collected during our research phase for everybody to engage with, in addition to the performance that they were watching and the other interactive elements that were there on their screen. This was a cross-platform work, so you could watch it on your mobile or on your tablet or on your computer screen. And this was the very end of the show. I wanted the audiences to leave with a thought, and this quote from my favorite Lithuanian American poet and filmmaker Jonas Mekas is quite poignant. And it says, "In the very end, civilizations perish because they listen to their politicians and not to their poets." And this was the parting sort of thought of the show. So I'll stop my screen share now and bring myself back up, um, and sort of wind up and maybe open this talk out to questions that any of you might have about the process or about the content or the politics of the work. I'd be very happy to respond to them. And um, this was just one project. There are a couple of other projects that I have also made, which are available on my website. So I'd be very happy to engage with anyone who has, you know, curiosity and interest beyond this talk as well about this topic. So thank you. And Humaira, please, um, if there are any questions that you have or others have, do share them.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I'm sure it's a lot of information to take in, and we have questions to ask you. I request the participants to write their questions in the chat box.
Sorry to interrupt. Is it only for me?
Is there an echo?
No, now it's fine on your side. Yeah, you can.
Yeah, so I request the participants to write their questions in the chat box, or you can either unmute yourself and ask.
Humaira, you know what you could do as an icebreaker? Just ask any question that comes to your mind right now. Ask me about the weather, and we can, we can just start talking, and I'm sure somebody will have the guts to intervene and ask a question in a couple of minutes.
Well,
The
then
first
I'll
question
ask.
is always the most difficult one in a
Yeah.
post-doc scenario.
Well, I'll ask work itself. So your work spans across theater, visual art, installation, interactive art, and more. So how do you pull all these dimensions together, and what are the politics of your praxis?
Um, for me, like I said, I don't think in terms of discipline. Um, I think I don't know how I think. I think very intuitively. I think, and I'm not afraid to move to a discipline or enter a discipline I know nothing about, and learn and start sort of playing around with it. I think depends on context. For me, a lot of my work is contextual. So, for example, I've been running a 2-year-long project of billboard art in Delhi. This was part of an exhibition that was curated by the Rux Media Collective at the Max Miller Bhavan, and that was an interesting opportunity for me um, to appropriate a, a public signboard, which otherwise would be near impossible because of the economics involved and all the different permissions that I need to take, um, to use this opportunity, um, and to install a public signboard sort of inside the Max Miller Bhavan and facing outwards, which became a billboard that would project minute thoughts, like very, very sort of tiny thoughts. And those thoughts came from um, my rehearsal notes. So I meticulously jot down rehearsal notes, and I have diaries and diaries of thoughts and instructions and sometimes half-baked sort of sentences from the last 15 years of having created performances and being in theaters. And I went back to those notes and tried to distill them into um, propositions of the body. And so the entire project then became sort of, the billboard became its form, and those 5 rows that I had on the billboard were uh, they were the vehicle and also the limitation of this form, um, and I started to think about the citizen subject as a performer or an actor uh, who needed a director's instruction every day, and started to imagine what instruction would I give the passers-by or the citizens of Delhi, and did that for 2 years. And I'd never done that before, and I don't think I will do this project again. Um, and similarly, there are other projects that I've done which I think started from an intention and an idea, and then slowly, when the form became apparent, I learned the form, and then also broke a few rules, and um, just went ahead and did it. And just there were some successes and some failures, and that's always the case. But I essentially don't think in terms of discipline. So it's I think it's quite, I don't know, trendy to introduce oneself as an interdisciplinary practitioner. It's a tongue twister. It doesn't sit easy on the tongue. Um, but for lack of another word, I think this is what this is how it is right now. I like the phrase social practice a little bit more. I think because of the sociality that it mobilizes, and that is what I think my projects do, because I am interested in the interrelationalities, and the politics of gatherings and why we gather. You know, what what is it that we're looking for in a public assembly, um, and the different kinds of provocations that can be introduced, and offered uh, to people when they gather. And I think that for me is social practice. Sometimes to be the provocateur, and at other times to gently nudge and push and uh, leave leave things for interactions here and there. So so that's I think the best way that I can answer that question.
Thank you so much. I think Davisha has a question for you. Would you like to unmute?
Who has a question? Sorry, does somebody have a question?
Yes, it's on the chat box.
It's in the chat box. Okay, my question is related to VR installations by virtual artists. So there have been a lot of war narratives, memory related work on VR, especially by Korean artists. What position uh, can we can we out VR in this notion of cyber theater? Can that be a part of it?
I think it's what we are.
Sorry, say again.
What position is correctly.
What position can we get? Sorry, Rashmi, I can't hear you properly.
What position? I don't know. It's quite terrible.
Your voice is all garbled, so it
Okay.
might be a technical.
Okay, I'll change.
Right. So
Hello, sir.
yeah.
I have a very bad throat, so
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to hear
I
that.
hope I can read it well enough. So basically, my question is about VR installations by virtual. There has been a lot of work on war narrative and memory-related work on VR, and especially by Korean artists, it has been published in Musée d'Art Museum in Paris. So I just wanted to know your opinion about this entire notion of VR in cyber theater, and can that be a part of it altogether?
Right. Yeah, I guess virtual reality is. You're right. There are many artists who've done work related to war narratives and memory. There's uh, somebody that I was in conversation with just last week, somebody called Ben Samuels who works in Chicago, and he recently had created a virtual reality uh, project based on his experience of witnessing his father battle dementia. And so again, this project was about a very personal project. Was It was about sort of memory and personal loss, and the the relationship and how it affected his relationship with his father. Um, and so, in the virtual reality, the audience was invited to enter and meet the father and the son. It was called the Fatherland. You can Google it and maybe know a little bit more about it. And I yeah, so it's quite virtual reality is an exploding genre, and I think a lot of different artists and different people are approaching it in different ways. Uh, of course, the war narrative is also a subversion of the more popular war games that millions and millions of people play, which are, I think, more popularly known as MMORPGs. So the multiplayer online role playing games. Um, so there is a lot of theatricality in the way we are both in the commercial sphere as well as in the experimental and the artistic sphere is being put to use. So I guess it's an open territory right now, and it's for you as an artist or a designer to decide what what you want to do with VR.
Am I audible? Oh.
I can hear it's very garbled at my end, but I don't know if that is on my end only or is it for everyone
No,
else.
I think it's me right now.
Couldn't
It's the
hear you.
same here also, ma'am.
Yeah, Humaira, you can't hear her properly either, right?
Yes.
Okay. Um, should I go on to the next question then?
Yes, sir. Would you like me to read it for you?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Sharon has a question about the technicalities of the play. What were the means you all took as project runners to deal with technical issues for audiences other than the chat? Additionally, there's a certain amount of fear in the audience that they would miss out. So, how did you all deal with it?
So the technicalities of the play, when you work with coders and programmers, um, they have their own vocabulary, uh, which is quite strange for artists. Um, so I had to spend about a couple of months workshopping with them. So they workshopped. So they conducted workshops that I was a part of, and I conducted workshops they were a part of, so that we could arrive at a common ground, a common vocabulary of what was needed, um, and when they used a word, what it meant, and when I used a word, what it meant. So that was the first hurdle. That was purely semantic and language and vocabulary based. Um, and then the next hurdle was, of course, how to build the coding language. And here it was very necessary for me to actually have my dramaturg as well. So I work for the last 3 or 4 years. I've been working with the same dramaturg who writes for me for my performances, and she develops the text uh, while we are in the process of making the work. So I usually do not pick up published scripts or texts or whatever. So everything that I produce is new and for the purpose of the project that I'm in. So the dramaturg, was also working very closely with the coders. And this is a kind of a relationship that actually you never hear of, that a writer and a coder who are working together, right? A fiction writer and a programmer were working together. But it was important in this project that they worked together because the way the programmers were developing the code, they were um, writing the possibilities that would be explored by performers and audiences once the show was ready. And it was for these possibilities that the dramaturg was writing. So the way this project was built, it was impossible for a writer to write a linear story. You know, when writers write, there is a beginning and a middle and an end, um, and so the story starts at some point, it reaches its crisis, and then it reaches a resolution. And so that's how most stories are written. But for this kind of a work, it was not relevant to write in this model. The 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 idea that I discussed with my dramaturg was this: that imagine that you're walking through a strange city and you know nothing about the city. It's extremely unfamiliar. Its buildings, its people, the way everything looks, its air, the fragrances that you smell. Everything is very unfamiliar to you. It's very new. But imagine that as you walk through lanes, that you're able to hear conversations of people inside those buildings somehow. And so you pick up on conversations. You pass by the first sort of set of houses, and you pick up on conversations there, and then you pass by the second set and pick up on conversations there. Sometimes you listen in more. Um, sometimes something interests you and you want to stay with the conversation a little bit. And so you're always overhearing something as you're going around. And could this be a format in which you start to write? And so she did a marvelous job, actually. She started writing, and she started writing scraps of conversations. You know, half a page here, a half a page there, a page here, a page there. So what in a month's time, what I had was a collage of conversations, right? It was as if a crowd was murmuring, and depending on where you were in that crowd, you would hear a few people and not hear other people. And then as you pushed your way through the crowd and went to the other part, then you would hear these people and not the people you've left behind, right? So 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 and this is how the whole dramaturgy of it started to develop. So it did not have a beginning or a middle or an end. It was fairly fluid, and no matter whether you stayed with one character for 5 minutes or in one room for an entire hour, your experience of the show would particularly be your own. So there were about 125 ways to experience the show, because the audiences would take different decisions of leaving rooms or staying in rooms, and um, which room to go next to, etc., etc. So everybody was deciding for themselves. And so there were these sort of multiple ways in which you could experience the show. Yet, I wanted to also retain the feeling that nobody felt that they missed out on something. Um, and so they got a sense of the show. They got a sense of, this is what this show was about. Um, of course, when you chose to watch something, you were missing so much else that was also happening. And so, as you became more and more keenly aware of what you were missing, you had this urge to come back. So, we had repeat audiences. So, after the first show, there were about 30% of the audience came back to watch the second show and the third show. Um, and it's a show that demands repeated viewings, because every time you come back, you will actually experience and witness a new character, a new story. and you will go deeper and deeper. Maybe watch a new film or enter a sound installation that you did not watch the last time, and get deeper and deeper and deeper into this world that has been made for this project. How did I deal with the fear that audiences would miss out? I actually like this fear that audiences have of missing out on something. One of the politics of my work is that uh, it should not be entirely visible to everybody. I don't like things that are very crystal clear and sort of very easily viewable. Um, so whenever I make work, I'm also trying to make things harder to view, or hiding things, or planting little sort of surprises and secrets here or there for anybody who comes exploring and seeking something to find it. Um, Even when I direct say, when I create physical theatre, I often make the audiences sit in ways that they're not able to watch the entire play. Um, some part of the play is always invisible to them, always difficult to watch. And this politics of optics for me is important, I think, and I'm just going to leave it there. For me, it's important.
I have a question. Is it still echoing?
No, it's perfect now, Rashmi.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Okay, so thanks, Amitesh. That was really mind-blowing, actually, in terms of the form that you've been experimenting with. It's still echoing to me, but I'll just carry on. Okay? It's a bit weird. Okay, so I want to start with this thing that you concluded with in terms of the politics of optics, which is something that I'm very deeply interested in. And to cut a long story short, basically, maybe, and I want to invite you to talk about the address, okay? And I mean the address in terms of, let's say, how one thinks of address in relation to a city and navigating a city, and address as a particular location within the city, but also address in terms of representation. Which I find very interesting in the work that you're, developing as an interdisciplinary, in the sense of how you use nishast as a place where the gazes are not yet settled, and very quickly it will be settled, right? Once we figure out what this form is. So in some sense, this feeling of going in search for the lost poet, we don't know what the address is. We're kind of strolling through the city, and then we stroll through this space. But in terms of disciplines, even in terms of the interdisciplinarity, theatre, cinema, or even the video game, all of which find their way here, and perhaps sound art, we don't know, have developed specific traditions of address. And I find it very interesting in that here the public, the audience, or the spectator is always singular in some sense, right? Not singular in the technical kind of understanding of singularity, but alone within a crowd. And so that reverses the relationship that we've had in terms of, even in whether it's in cinema or in theatre, as the actor being the individual to whom a crowd or a public relates, ensuing from that relationships of fandom, in relation to Indian and South Indian cinema, there's a lot of work done on fans and politics and the voting citizen, spectator, and an entire kind of assumption of how representative democracy works vis-a-vis this relationship of individual on stage and the audience off stage. Whereas here, it seems to be reversed in some sense. Uh, Not quite reversed, but it's significantly changed in the sense that it's a one-to-one and a one-to-many encounter. Your 5 actors playing 35 roles uh, encountered very differently by every single individual. So I come back to your point about the politics of this optics, because I've myself been trying to understand for a long time whether the mode of representation that we're being, uh, you know, pushed to somehow explore or create is the mode of expression of representation that belongs to a post-democratic, in terms of, the word representation as symbolizing both politics as well as aesthetics in some sense. So it's a long-winded question, but it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I find it interesting in the way that you're developing modes of address, yet at the same time insisting that there's a politics to the optics. So maybe you can share your thoughts on this.
Okay, there are many. Rashmi, can you keep your video on if that's okay?
Sure,
for you?
sure.
But I get a sense that I'm kind of talking into a void, which is exactly what my actors also experienced when they were performing. But they got used to it. They're far more talented than I am. So it's nice to just look at you also um, and talk about this question of address. Now there are many questions that are hidden in, I think, underneath what you've expressed, and thank you for coming in with that, because I think almost every um, almost every echo of what you have asked is quite insightful and an excellent observation and a query. What I'll do is I'll try and sort of break it down into smaller parts and respond to each one specifically from the perspective of the last poet, but also from the larger sort of convictions that I have as an artist while developing works. And the first one is, I'll just take the bull by its horns. I'll take the idea of representation, actually, which I think is the overarching kind of idea. So I align with the practice of visible theatre and not invisible theatre. Now, in the 1940s, this we in the history of theatre, we find that there is a cleaving that takes place, especially with the onset of Bertolt Brecht onto the scene of modern theatre in Germany, where he would say that, that I don't want the wings, I don't want the green room, I want to be able to see the mechanics of theatre, the labor of theatre, um, and I want the audience to see how the illusion of theatre is propped up. So, in a sense, making the machine and the labor visible along with the product that was being presented to the audience, right? So, um, and so he and many others who followed in his footsteps later practiced what became known as visible theatre, in the sense that theatre that actually exposes, takes the curtain away and exposes the making of it and what goes on into creating it as part of the process of showing the work as well. And this is in sharp contrast to invisible theatre, or the other common word for it is illusionary theatre, the theatre that actually creates illusions, the box set, or wonderful scenographies and sets, um, and invites the audience to immerse in, invites the audience to engage in the suspension of disbelief, as it were, which also happens with cinema a lot, where the illusion of the film, the story, the character is ultimate. And this is exactly why that actors in films never face the camera and talk. So they never look in the camera and talk. So that's the fourth wall convention that's actually coming from and I'm sure you know it, and maybe this is for the students as well, that the fourth wall convention of illusionistic theater becomes the rule of not looking into the camera while making cinema and films. And so I align myself to visible theater in the sense that, so, directly addressing, looking into the camera, smashing the fourth wall, is something that I've been working with for quite some time. And even in The Last Poet, as the performers moved from one character to another, they also removed makeup in front of the camera. They removed their wigs, they changed clothes, they put on new clothes, put on another wig, another makeup, while while performing a text, right? So there were many nebulous moments in the show where you actually could not really pin the question of representation. Who is this actor right now, as he or she carries half the makeup of the previous character and is putting on the makeup of the subsequent one, and it's a very eerie kind of a face that's present right now, that's in between worlds or in between lives or in between texts, in a sense. And for me, those are the moments that are very special. Those are the moments that are very precious. So that the camera also becomes not just a lens in front of which an illusion is propped up, but also in front of which where the illusion is taken down. The actor turns around, as it were, and you can see the back, you can see the wounds, the injury, the who this person is really. In The Last Poet, many performers took their cameras with them as they moved in their house from one part to the other part, so that the illusion of the scene that they were playing got broken by by reminding the audience that they are in somebody's house right now, in a real house, in a with a real person, and then a corner of that house then lends itself to the fiction of the play again. And so this break happens every 6-7 minutes. So this rhythm of in a 90-minute show, if this is the kind of interruption, this is how frequent the interruption is taking place, you kind of get used to this sort of alienation that you keep going in and out and keep getting reminded, and also the fact that this interaction is also part of that. Inviting the interaction is also part of that sort of passive viewing of address, where it is not the audience who's being addressed, but it is also the audience that is choosing to abandon or to stay, and also to choose which scene gets played next. And interestingly, it was actually in the poll that everybody got reminded that they were watching the show with everybody else, because many audience members had the experience that they chose a scene which did not get played, right? And so they got frustrated. There was this, why are other people choosing this other option, whereas I want to watch the third option or the fourth option? And so they would stay on in that room, wait for the poll to appear again, and then again hope that what they have voted for would get played by the actor. And sometimes they would not get any of the scenes that they preferred, that they voted for throughout the show, and they had to come back again with the hope that they would be successful later. So, so this kind of an address is complicated. Also, have to say that when I was making work for this online medium, I had to keep in mind that I'm not actually making conventional theater where the venue, the building, the audience, the spatial relationship between the audience and the actor um, are historically controlled and set. Right? Theater architectures are one of the most beautiful architectures in the world. Simultaneously, they also co-opt work. So when as a director you're making work for the proscenium, you are already making work in a set relationship of where the audience will sit, where the actors will stand, and how they will address the audience, and how will this representation work. Um, on making work on screen is absolutely a new territory, because I have to think simultaneously like a film director, because the dominant medium is the camera and the screen. So I'm thinking in terms of frames, images, visuals, what follows what. I'm also thinking like a theatre director because the entire show is live. And I'm also thinking like an internet director because of the code that is actually the organizing agent. It's the program that we've built that's that is also sharing my agency with the audience, and the performer's agency as well, because it's organizing the show in a way in which audiences sort of go from one room to another, or get tempted to leave or tempted to stay. And I'll tell you how this temptation, actually, how I figured this temptation works, and the politics of interfaces. Um, so when we created the show, and we did the alpha version of the show, in programming language they do the alpha version and then the beta version and then the final the final platform gets goes live. In the alpha version, when we invited a test audience to come in, we invited 50 people. It was a closed door showing. 50 people came in from spread across the country. They logged in, they watched the show. In the alpha version, the leave button was always visible and always active, so that you could leave whenever you wanted. After the show got over, and I gave a feedback form to our test audience, and they filled it in very generously, sent it back to us. I discovered that almost everyone said that they had a feeling that they were being rushed through the show, that they could not stay, that this leave button was always there reminding them that there is something else to watch. How much richer and how deeper does this world go? And um, the leave button was egging them on, into not staying anywhere for more than a couple of minutes. And I thought that was a pity. So in the beta version, we took the leave button away, and we introduced the leave button only every 9 or 10 minutes, and it stayed for 1 minute. If you clicked on it, you were out. If you didn't, then you would have to stay in that room for the next 9 or 10 minutes, and you're stuck there. Right? The audience feedback I got afterwards was wonderful. Everybody got the show. They enjoyed the show. They loved the fact that they were stuck inside rooms and they did not have a choice. And when the choice occurred, they had to choose, etc., etc. And that revealed to me that this is exactly how the politics of interfaces work. That interfaces are actually uh, um, invitations to behave differently, right? Um, and the way you, as an artist making work online, clicks and movement on the screen and the choices that I'm presented with are um, innately political. Which choices am I presented with at what point, and what are they making me do, is not just a technical question; it's a political question. You know, and so I started to think about the interface a little more, with a little more alertness, of what it means in terms of immersion, what it means in terms of experience, and the kind of relationships that audiences were forging. This one to many that you spoke about, this is a very interesting one for online performances, because you do have the deceptive experience of watching an online performance as if you are the only one watching it. Right? So that in The Last Poet, the actor was always looking into the camera, and the audience had the feeling that they were being spoken to directly. Um, and it was only when the poll occurred is when everybody understood that, oh my God, there are others also watching along with me. And so this one to many and many to one is actually a sort of a, I would say, a smoke screen for the online. And a lot of artistic work is actually trying to subvert this, um, and to see and to explore ways in which there is a sense of a public gathering, an acknowledgement, an ever-present, um, sort of a sensation that I am here amongst everybody else right now. I'm not saying that this is a compensation for physical assembly, but in its own way, I think it is a way to think about digital assemblies in public ways, and what this public assembly can, uh, promises, um, in terms of possibilities to us. Yes, I would say that a large part of The Last Poet and subsequent works that I am now making are small experiments in democracies, in trying to understand, how does how does sort of choice, responsibility, dialogue, interrelationality, work, in terms of online presence. What's interesting in The Last Word is that you actually never meet the poet. So the protagonist is missing always. There's an empty center, there's a vacant center. Everybody seems to be talking around him and about him, but you never get to meet the person. So there is a listlessness to this experience, and that is at the heart of our online experience, where I am both present and absent at the same time. I'm disembodied as well as it's an it's a disembodied embodiment in a sense, and so the binary opposite, the binaries of presence and absence, of physical and not physical and not present, somehow are being collapsed, somehow are being sort of have given, the gray areas between have, I think, have emerged, which are far more interesting, for online work. So I would stop here. I can keep going on and on and on, but I would stop here as.
No, thanks a lot. I mean, there's a lot to kind of crunch on and think through, in terms of politics of visibility, invisibility, not only in the context of the history of theatre as you've kind of sketched it, but in terms of being visible and audible as a citizen in some sense as well. So yeah, thanks.
I'll just add one last thing, and maybe it's important to mention it here, is that if I perform, in a physical space, I need three kinds of licenses and a censorship approval, to perform. Whereas in the digital sphere, it's right now complete and utter freedom, and there are no licenses. There are no so. And I think it's an interesting. This is an interesting. This is exactly what artistic freedom wants: a space and a venue and a time, which is in some senses unmediated, by power. You know, it could be mediated through technologies and through other sort of mediums, but entirely unmediated through power. And the sheer absence of an authority right now on the digital sphere is what is exciting for me to keep creating work.
Yeah, let's hope that power remains absent.
I think we are past the time.
Yeah, 3 minutes, 4 minutes over.
Yeah. Does anybody have any more questions, or can we just?
Chai ka time ho gaya. Everybody, I hope all of you are either making tea or are yearning for tea. We can wrap up here. It's 6:30, past 6:30. I hope everybody enjoyed this talk, and there was something valuable, or a question that you would go back with. And just want to say again, thank you to Humaira. All the best with your research project. It sounds very, very interesting, and all the best to everyone else who's also part of this course. It sounds like a wonderful course, and thank you, Rashmi, for making this happen and for leading all these students, these wonderful students.
We have to say thank you to you for making time, and in a general atmosphere of doom and gloom and just bad news streaming in faster than we wanted to. I think it's very important to gather and reassure people that there are others and there's a community and there's some solidarity and space for conversation. So thanks. Let's really hope that we get through these terrible, terrible times and that we have occasion to laugh loudly soon.
Let's hope so. Yes, let's hope so. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for enlightening us and sharing with us your experience. Thank you so much for your time. I certainly agree that there's more to theater. I also feel that somehow amidst all these experiments, we are also trying to locate ourselves, find who we actually are, and where we are heading towards. So I'm grateful that this event turned out very rewarding and worthwhile. I especially want to thank Rashmi ma'am for guiding me throughout and making this happen. Thank you all the participants for joining us today. I hope you all had a fruitful time. Ma'am, would you like to add something? Say something?
Nothing I've said. Thank you. I will write a email or something. Thanks, Amitesh.
I just want to add that if you're interested to watch the show, we'll be doing more shows of The Last Poet next month. I usually announce these shows on social media, on my social media pages, and also on the website that I have where a lot of my work is archived. So you can follow me there and do watch the show and write to me. Please write to me, text me. I'm very interested to know your thoughts about it. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Mukta, should we end the meeting?